the individual clauses of some of those licenses. Licenses are something that they're like the constitution of the project, if you like, where a project says, the license says what other people are allowed to do with the source code of the project, or the binaries of the project for that matter. And different projects choose different licenses. Some are very popular, some are less popular. So now the early days, a little bit of history again. In the early days of free software, many projects used extremely simplistic licenses. And so this license, this was the license I chose for the very first version of Samba I released in January 1992. And it's a license I just made up myself. Okay, so let's have a look at that license. It says that permission to use, copy and distribute this software. I must have read somebody else's license and got that phrase, you know, sounds nice and legalistic. Permission to use, copy and distribute this software is given to anyone who wants to for non-profit only, capitalised. You may not charge for this software or any derivatives of it without first contacting the author. Okay, what's wrong with this license? It's a terrible license, so why? Well,
every person who's going to do anything with it has to talk to the author directly.
Yes, unless it's all completely non-profit. So that means that if somebody wants to sell CD-ROMs containing Linux distributions, right, like an Ubuntu CD, and they're selling them for $2 a copy at a street corner, which is perfectly fine, they couldn't include my software unless they personally contacted me and said, may I include your software? And of course I would have said yes, but why should they have to contact me in the first place? Right? It also doesn't have any disclaimers. I don't disclaim warranty. So potentially, somebody could say, your software caused my nuclear power plant to melt down. Right? And I would say that, oh, but you know, you got it for free, you can't blame me. I assumed there was a warranty with it. I should be disclaiming the warranty and saying, to just protect myself, I should be saying, there is no warranty with this program, just to make sure that some shady lawyer doesn't sue me later for the misuse of the software or creating bad software. So licenses are extremely important for protecting the author of the software from dodgy lawyers, but also for ensuring that the users of the software can do what they want, what the author wants them to do with the software without going through the laborious task of contacting the author. Now this sort of license was very, very common, and this type of license was common up until maybe 1994, 1995 or so, when people started adopting better licenses. I mean, smart people adopted them much early. I was a bit of a late blossoming person in the free software world, and people like Richard and Stallman and others used much more sophisticated license much earlier. I didn't. I just used this simple one, but it was only in place for a period of a couple of months before I fixed it. And then versions a couple of months later used the GNU General Public License, which we'll be talking about. But this type of license is still causing me pain 18 years later. In fact, a lawyer contacted me 3 weeks ago because of a licensing problem caused by this type of thing back in 1994, when somebody contributed a patch to Samba, and that patch added a fairly simple feature, and they got their patch from another free software package, and that other free software package had no license statement on it at all. So that other free software package was intended to be free software. It was intended by the use. It was distributed by people who are well known in the free software community and who have later released lots more free software. It was intended for use in that, for everyone to use it, but they didn't explicitly say so in their license header. And now, a lawyer who's been trawling through the Samba source code for various reasons, right, came across this and said, do you have proof that you were allowed to use that contribution to Samba from 1994? Now, almost certainly I am. The problem is that contacting that person who's left the company, 10 years ago, and his email address might have changed, is difficult. So what we're doing is rewriting that little piece of code to replace it to keep that lawyer happy, right? So bad licensing decisions can cost you pain and can cause you to have lots of trouble talking to lawyers much later, which is also painful, depending on the lawyer. 10, 15 years later, you can still get troubles with licenses. So get it right from the beginning.
Is that not so much what license you chose, but more like the signed off by?
Yeah, it's similar to the signed off by, and but it was more that was the license that was chosen by the person who released that other package.
Yeah.
Now that other package was a piece of free software, and it's very widely used. It was called the POP password package. Some of you might have used it, right? Which allows you to change passwords on POP servers. Well, back in 1994, when it was widely used, it was actually released in 93 or 92, I think, but it was certainly widely used in 1994. They didn't have any license on it at all. It just had, there's the code, with no license, and they put it up for free download, and they even encouraged people to download it, announcing it on various lists. But they didn't want to care about that legal gunk, so they didn't put a license at the top, right? And that's causing me pain a lot later. So anyway, that's the point of this lecture, is to understand these licenses to make sure you get things right and you don't cause people pain 20 years down the track. Okay, so what does a license do? A copyright license gives certain permissions. The default under copyright law, there's a section of law called copyright law, and the default is that when you first create a work, like a piece of source code, right, or a painting or anything else, any sort of work in a substantial form, you immediately get copyright. A long time ago, it used to be that you had to write copyright and your name on it. That's no longer true. That went out a long time ago. Most people still do write copyright on it, but it's not necessary in most countries, pretty much any country, I think, these days. Okay? And so the default with copyright is that when I put something up and release it, people can view it, but they can't create derivative works. They can't redistribute it. They can't create another work based on that work. So if there's no license on that explicitly saying you may do something, you need to assume you can't. Right? Now in some countries there's some minimal rights you do get, sort of fair use type rights, but within the software field you pretty much have to assume they don't exist. They certainly don't exist in all countries. So you pretty much have to assume if it doesn't have a license on it, you can't use it. Okay, so the key permissions you need to give people is permission to use the software. Right? If you're putting out some free software, then it's a good idea to actually give your users permission to use it. Permission to study the software, so you have to give them permission to be able to look at your code to learn how to write their own code or write something better or worse or whatever they might want to do with it. You need to give them permission to modify the software. Right? If you want them to be able to modify the software, you have to explicitly give them that permission, because they don't have that permission under copyright law by default. And you have to also give them permission to distribute modified or unmodified versions. They have to have permission to take your software and then they can give it on to other people. Right? Otherwise, everyone would have to come back to you, the original author, to give out each copy, and that will get very tedious after a while. Right? If your intent is that lots of people use this software, you want other people to be able to pass it on to their friends and keep going. Okay, so that's what the license needs to do. It can also set conditions. So a license, say copyright license, can say you may have all these wonderful things and do all you like with the software as long as you only stand on your left foot and hold your ear while doing it. You can say that in a license if you want to. Right? Probably nobody would use the software, or they won't read the license, but you could say that. Now, usually the sorts of things you would say in the license conditions is you might, for example, say that if you create a derived work, so you create a new piece of software based upon your software, so it's a new work based upon the previous work, then you might require that the new work is licensed under the same or a similar license. Right? Why would you do that? Why would you require that new works, if I write a piece of software and release it as free software, okay, I could say you can do anything you like with the software. End of story. I could say that. Or I could say, if you create a new piece of software based on mine, you have to release that as free software under this same license as well. Why would you do that?
To avoid people to use it for commercial purposes.
Yeah? So the answer was to avoid people to use it for commercial purposes. And slight twist on that, using it usually in the free software world, we're absolutely fine about people using it for commercial purposes. Commercial involves money, commerce. right? And usually, I mean, if you looked at my original license, you can see that I was anti-commercial then. I was trying to prevent people using it for commercial purposes. I didn't want people to make profit. Profit was ugly or bad. Well, I've changed my mind since then. It's fine. I don't mind people making a profit out of my software. And they don't have to give me any of that profit. That's absolutely fine, right? But I do want something else. If they enhance my software or to make a new piece of software based upon mine, they have to give me back their enhancements. I want them to contribute back. All right? And that's what I'm talking about here, where I say you can set a condition forcing derived works to be under the same license. And you do that when you want to ensure that your software is not used as part of a piece of proprietary software. And the reason for that is you want to see free software thrive. If you want to see free software have an advantage over proprietary software, then one of the advantages that free software can give to itself is require that anyone that creates a new piece of software based upon this software also release it as free software. That means if I release a really good piece of software, other people will be tempted to also release free software in order to be able to use mine as part of theirs. So I have this leverage where I'm tempting people to produce more free software. That's a good thing, because I'm tempting people to do my work for me. I'm tempting people to produce more of what I want to produce so I don't have to do as much work. And that's really what that idea is about. And that's the basis of a concept called copyleft, which we'll look at a bit more during this lecture. Okay, we might put on advertising or marketing restrictions. So we could say in our license, if you distribute this software, then you must put a notice on the distribution, on the packaging, saying that this product is based upon the work of Andrew Tridgell. All right? So that's a enforcement of credit. I'm saying that whenever they distribute this software or make it part of a product, they have to give me credit by making sure that the people who receive the product understand that I contributed to that. Now, what's good and bad about that? Tell me what some advantages and disadvantages of putting an advertising clause like that in a license might be. Who can tell me an advantage of doing that?
Author gets an acknowledgement.
An acknowledgement, yes. And why do you want the acknowledgement?
So what are the hard work they did?
To acknowledge all the hard work you've done, indeed.
And
you might even gain some advantage out of it. Maybe if you advertise the fact that you're the original author, when somebody wants enhancements to it, they might come back to you and pay you as a consultant. Maybe they'll give you a job. Maybe they'll send you free pizza. That's what happened to me. I got a whole lot of free pizza for Samba because I mentioned that I like pizza to the Samba users, and I got a whole lot of free pizza. So all sorts of things can happen out of this by getting credit, right? What's the disadvantage of that sort of clause? What's the disadvantage of saying that you are required to advertise the fact that it was derived from this software whenever you distribute a product based upon it? What could go wrong?
The list will go really long.
Sorry?
If it's a real life project,
Yep.
the list may go quite long.
Exactly. When you install something like FreeCiv or Westnorth or the other projects, Stellarium and others that you worked on during the last lab, right, how many dependencies were there for those projects? How many other libraries? Right? Some of them are like 40 or 50. How many authors are there for all those different libraries?
Sometimes hundreds.
Right? So there might be in total hundreds or thousands of authors. Imagine if every time you wanted to produce a watch, right, based on Linux, and there are watches based on Linux, this one's not based on Linux, but there are some, right? And why do you laugh? This watch is based on Linux? Of course there are. There's phones, PDAs, all sorts of things.
We're laughing that you're not
Imagine
wearing one.
if you would have to inscribe on the back the names of all of the authors of all of the software. It'd be very hard to fit them all on if you use a little micro printing. It could get quite tricky. Okay, so this is known as an advertising clause, and it was quite common in software in the early to mid 90s, late 80s, early to mid 90s. Quite common to have a clause like that, and it was largely because software was less complex then. It tended to have less dependencies, and it wasn't as embedded as much in other products like watches, right? So that it meant that it was quite practical to give credit. Okay, and you still see that in some software, but it's less common now because of the problem. The list grows too long. It becomes too onerous. And when you have, you know, at the end of the political ads on television, they have to say, you know, written and performed by so-and-so and approved by the so-and-so party, all these great long things at the end of all the ads. Well, you can imagine every time they're advertising a car contains thousands of pieces of software in it. They had to at the end say, you know, this car partially built upon the work of, you know, those hundreds of people, right? It'd be a real pain. They wouldn't use free software. They'd use proprietary software instead. Okay?
If you just sample an old Mac Classic, you can see the signatures of the developers.
That's right, but that was done for credit, and if they missed one out, they're not going to get into trouble.
No.
Right? It's just purely for credit. So you might also set conditions. You might have disclaimers of warranty, which usually are a very good idea, right? To say that there is no warranty for this software, because otherwise some lawyer might think that you've provided a warranty and will come and sue you when the software doesn't work right. And if you're giving it away for free, you probably don't want to be sued for it not working right. Okay? Hopefully it will work right, but anyway, you can also disclaim all sorts of other guarantees. So that's the sort of basics of what a license does. It grants a set of permissions, but it applies a set of restrictions, and if you don't agree with the conditions, what can you do? Can you just ignore the conditions and use the software anyway?
Can't legally use it.
You can't use it. Because if you don't agree to all the conditions, the default is copyright law prevents you from distributing it, modifying it, etc. And in some places, using it. Use of software and whether it's distributed by copyright might depend on your jurisdiction, which country you're in, which state you're in. Okay, so lots of licenses. There are lots and lots of free software licenses. Many people would say there are too many free software licenses, right? There are, the Open Source Initiative lists 63 approved licenses. One of the main things that the OSI does is approves new licenses. So somebody comes up with a new license, right? A whole bunch of lawyers think they can do better than the previous lawyers. Just like I described yesterday, where sort of 95% of students think they're, you know, the top half of the class. Well, 95% of the lawyers think they're better than all the other lawyers, right? In which case they think they can make a new and better license than all the previous licenses, okay?
The lawyers just want to submit patches.
They should really submit patches, and they do have a patch-like system. They don't use different patch generally, though some lawyers do, but they often use differencing within Word or OpenOffice. I've seen lawyers do that rather a lot. Word level differencing. Anyway, so there are 63 approved licenses, and so when somebody comes up with a new license, they can send it to the OSI Open Source Initiative, and the people on the board of the OSI will examine the license and see if they think it's a good one, see if it meets the conditions, all of the open source definition, and see if they think it adds something useful to the set of licenses. And if they think it's all good, they will approve the license and it'll get added, and then there'll be 64 approved licenses. 9 of those licenses are reasonably widely used. So most of them are quite niche type licenses that apply to just a few pieces of software, and then 9 of them are applied to fairly large numbers, sort of hundreds or thousands of pieces of software, or in some cases hundreds of thousands of pieces of software. The GNU project lists 81 free software licenses, so a slightly different number, right, from the OSI, partly because they're categorising it differently. The GNU project has a separate categorisation for sort of version 1 and version 1.1 of some licenses, whereas the OSI treats it as one license. So that the counting is a little bit different. It also lists 28 non-free licenses. So it lists 28 licenses that it doesn't consider to be free software. They might look like free software licenses, but they've got some problem which doesn't quite allow them to meet the free software definition, and so they get rejected. And there's a page on the GNU site that explains why each license is good or bad, or why it's rejected as a free software license. And it often suggests alternative licenses that you could use which have similar aims to the one that's rejected. Okay, these are the key licenses. These are, now of course I've cut this down, there's 81 there, I'm now down to just 4, right? There's more than that obviously, but these are the ones that are most commonly used and most popular. Of these, the first one here accounts for something like I think it's about 70 or 75% of all software, free software at the moment. So 70 to 75% of the software that's running on your systems in the lab there is licensed under this GNU General Public License, right? Which is the one that was originally come up with by Richard Stallman, but newer versions of it have come up with variations where there's been committees working on it to create the latest version of the software. And I'll talk a bit more about the committee process and how new versions of these licenses come out later in the lecture. Okay, so this is the most popular. The BSD licenses, there's two main variants of the BSD license. There's the original BSD license and the modified BSD license. The original BSD license was the one that was first used when the University of California in Berkeley released that BSD version of Unix. Remember I talked about that in the last lecture, in the history of FOSS. And they chose quite a short, simple license, but it included an advertising clause. Remember I mentioned the advertising clause at the start of the lecture, saying requiring you to, in all of your advertising for the product, mention that it was based on this software. Well, the original BSD license included that type of advertising clause, and that caused quite a few problems. And so the modified version, the main thing it does is to remove that advertising clause. And it's often referred to as the obnoxious advertising clause because it tends to be quite painful for other free software projects. All right, welcome. Okay, so next major license that is fairly widely used is the MIT, also known as the X11 license. It's actually similar in concept to the BSD license in many ways, just different wording. And again, it's fairly widely used, particularly with programs that use the X Windows system. So the X Windows system is the display system that's used on my laptop here and on all of the machines that you use in the lab. And they chose a slightly different license to other groups, and that license, partly because of the huge popularity of the X Windows system, that license has propagated onto new projects. How does that happen, by the way? Why do you think that just because X11 is widely used, why do you think that other projects adopt the same license? How does that happen?
You use the software and find it's easy to integrate with what they've already
Yeah.
existing in the framework.
The biggest factor, I think, is imitation. If you admire another project, you often imitate what it's doing, right? And so you admire this other project, and you might be producing software that is in some way related to that other project. And so you look at the license that they chose, and you just copy the license and put it into your product, all right? Your piece of software. So that's what I did when I switched away from the custom license that I wrote, and I then switched to the GPL. I did that back in 1992 without reading the GPL, right? Which is really rather strange, to adopt a license without even reading it. And I chose it at that time because I admired two particular projects. I admired the GCC project, GNU C compiler, which was released under the GNU General Public License. I thought it was a fantastic compiler, an amazing piece of work, and I thought that I really, that's a great piece of free software. I'd like my software to be like that. And so I adopted their license. And the same with the Linux kernel. The Linux kernel was released under the GNU General Public License, and I was just starting to get used to using the Linux kernel, and I thought, yes, that looks like a great license. I'll use it. It was the same license as GCC. This looks like the license that other people are using. I'll choose the same license, right? Now later, I've studied the GNU GPL quite a lot. I've in fact participated in some of the committees that have looked at new versions of the license, and I'm really glad I made that choice. It is actually a very, very good license. But my original decision to use it was out of admiration for other projects. And that probably is the most common reason for choosing a license. Admiring another project that you're working with. Okay? There's also the Apache license, which you can probably guess where that comes from. The Apache web server. They chose the Apache license, and there's a whole lot of associated projects that are hosted within the Apache project environment, that most of those, or a lot of those, use the Apache license, and it has some very similar features to many of these other licenses. We'll be concentrating on these first two licenses in the next few slides. Okay, so this is the X11 license. It has one really big advantage. It's nice and short. It fits on one slide, which is great for giving a talk. So let's have a look at what it says. It says, you put at the top, you say copyright 1996, the X Consortium. Right? That basically declares who wrote it. Okay? So the X Consortium wrote it. Now, of course, an X Consortium isn't an individual. So the X Consortium organisation, which is, I believe, an incorporated organisation in the United States, is claiming copyright to this work. Okay? They is saying that permission is hereby granted free of charge to any person obtaining a copy of this software. So they don't care where you got it from. If you've managed to obtain a copy, right, then you, and associated documentation files, you may deal in the software without restriction, including without limitation the rights to use, copy, modify, merge, publish, distribute, sub-license, and or sell copies of the software, and to permit persons to whom the software is furnished to do so, subject to the following conditions. So that's the permissions. It's granting a whole bunch of permissions on what you can do with this software, including the ability to sell it. And it's not saying, and you have to give us a cut. You don't have to give a percentage of your sale back to the X Consortium. It's saying, yes, you can sell it. And very importantly, the rights that they are granting can be passed on to someone else. So it's not just the X Consortium granting the rights to people who download it, but if they then give it to someone else, the rights are passed on. And that's and to permit persons to whom the software is furnished to do so, subject to the following conditions. So you can, the people who receive it, pass it on to someone else, also pass along the same rights. Okay, and that's quite important because there are some licenses out there today which require each person to separately get the license back from the original author. Microsoft put out one like that. And it makes it impossible to integrate into the free software community because otherwise everyone who downloads it would have to separately go back to Microsoft in this case and say, please, can I have a license? Right? It just becomes unwieldy. Okay? Right. The above copyright notice and this permission notice shall be included in all copies or substantial portions of the software. So that's a bit like an advertising clause, but it's not too bad because it doesn't say you have to include it in advertising for the product based on it, only in portions of the software. So if you create a new piece of software based on this, and you use some of the software in your code, then you have to include this copyright notice in the new code. So you have to tell people about their rights, right, when they look at the code, but not when they receive the product, right? It's different from some licenses require that everyone who receives the product must be made, a product based on that software must be made aware of their licensed rights. The GNU GPL requires that, and that's why my new television that I got recently, when I go to the main system menu and I click on license, right, with the little remote control, it pops up a copy of the GNU General Public License. And that's to meet the requirement that all recipients must be made aware of their rights, right? This license doesn't say that. So they don't have to have a little button with the license when you have something based on X11. Then here's the warranty one, and it's in all capitals, because at some point, some lawyer claimed that the lack of warranty wasn't clear enough because it was just in normal letters, and so from then on, all lawyers decided that warranty conditions have to be put in uppercase, shouting, which actually, strangely enough, makes them harder to read. So it's actually much harder to see what the warranty conditions are because they're shouting at you in capital letters. Anyway, that's...
blinking? Should be
yeah, blinking tags. Someday there'll be a lawsuit and we'll end up with all blinking warranty tags. Yes, warranty clauses. Okay. This is software is provided as is without warranty. When I'm reading a license, I tend to just skip the bits that are in all caps. It's just sort of, anyway, it's the opposite of what you intended. Including but not limited to the warranty for warranties of versionability. Basically saying, don't sue us if it doesn't work. That's what it's saying. Next bit it says, except as contained in this notice, the name of the X Consortium shall not be used in advertising. Now that's interesting, isn't it? It's a reverse advertising clause. In other words, don't use their good name to advertise your product. They didn't want somebody to then create a product and say, based upon X Consortium's wonderful work, and of course they might have modified it, and in fact it might be a horrible product, and the X consortium didn't want their good name to be besmirched by somebody else's work, right? So they had an explicit clause that requires that in the advertising you may not mention the X consortium, all right, in your advertising. Okay, and finally, the X window system is a trademark of X consortium. That's just because in trademark law you have to make people aware of the trademark, otherwise you can eventually lose the trademark. Yeah.
What's an action of tort?
Where's that?
Whether in an action, a contract, tort, or otherwise, I don't know.
Whether an action, okay, not consortium will be liable for any claim damages, or whether in an action or contract, tort or otherwise. Tort is a type of legal action, I believe.
It's a court case.
Yeah. So
Isn't taught the law of
basically, it doesn't matter whether it's by contract or by sort of legal action or arising out. So they're just trying to disclaim all possible warranties, because if they'd left that out, then some lawyer would have come along and said, hey, you've only disclaimed it in a contract, but I'm doing a tort, not a contract, so you owe me. And so you have to include these silly disclaimers, right? And so it's a very silly part of legal history. Anyway, so the X11 license, that's a widely used license, particularly for programs related to the X Windows system, because that's where it came from. Okay, this was the original BSD license. So this was the license that was used in the, it's actually not all of the license, it's a little bit long for one slide, so I've chopped off at the top here a few lines of the license, which is just the copyright notice, and down the bottom I've chopped off some of the boilerplate at the bottom. This is the core of the license, where it actually grants the permissions and the restrictions. Alright, and it says that redistribution and use in source and binary forms with or without modification are permitted provided the following conditions are met. So this grants the use. Now notice that grant terms is much, much simpler. It achieves much the same thing as the X11 one in its grant. You can basically redistribute either source or binary with or without modification. So do what you like with it, basically. But you have to meet the following conditions. Redistributions of the source code must retain the above copyright notice, this list of conditions and the following disclaimer. So you have to include the license with any source code derived from this. Redistributions in binary form must reproduce the above copyright notice, this list of conditions and the following disclaimer in the documentation and/or materials provided with the distribution. So that means that every copy of the documentation that comes out, right, so if this watch was based on BSD, original BSD, and it came with a little manual, then somewhere in the manual it would have to say that a copy of this license, we have to reproduce the license in the manual. And you find that is true of many manuals for modern devices. You buy a fridge, you buy a phone, you buy a GPS. Look in the back of the manual, you'll very often find a free software license, right? A GPL or a BSD or similar, basically meeting this condition and including it. It's not too difficult because in a manual, of course, you can add extra pages at the end. Whereas it's the next clause that really causes problem. All advertising materials mentioning the features or use of this software must display the following acknowledgement. This product includes software developed by the University of California, Berkeley and its contributors. That was the problem. That list got too long, with lots of other people then put their own name, must contain advertising based, saying that I did some as well. And when you end up with hundreds or thousands of people, then the ad gets rather unwieldy. It gets very expensive to play on TV. Finally, neither the name of the university nor the names of its contributors may be used to endorse or promote the products, which is almost contradictory to this, not quite. You have to credit them, but you're not allowed to use them to help endorse your product. Little tricky, but maybe you can get through it. And write from the software without specific prior written permission. So you have to actually write to the university and ask them for permission to use their names to advertise the product. Okay, so that's the original BSD license, which caused quite a bit of pain, the advertising clauses in particular, and the new version of it is basically the same but without the advertising clause, right? Copyleft. So this is the revolutionary concept that Richard Stallman came up with. And can anyone think why this concept is called copyleft?
Play on words, the opposite of copyright.
Yeah, it's sort of the opposite of copyright. It sort of turns copyright back on itself, right? So it's copyleft instead of copyright. Okay, so there's two versions, there's many different versions of the copyleft idea. But this is the original version from, well actually GPL v1 really had it, but the most commonly used one up to a couple of years ago was GPL version 2, and this is the clause out of GPLv2. GPLv2 is quite long. It certainly doesn't fit on one slide, but this is the core paragraph that contains the concept of copyleft, which is the really new concept that the GPL introduced. It says, you must cause any work that you distribute or publish that in whole or in part contains or is derived from the program, this code we're releasing, or any part thereof to be licensed as a whole at no charge to all third parties under the terms of this license. So if you use this software to build a new piece of software, then you are required to release that software under the same license. And this license says that it's available to everyone, right? That ensures that if somebody makes a new piece of software based on this, that it also is free software. And this is a reaction to some things that happened quite commonly in the free software world. One of the most famous examples is the X Windows system. I showed you that X11 license a minute ago, and that didn't have a clause like this. And what happened was the X Window consortium released X Window, and then a whole lot of companies based their graphical user interfaces, all the various Unix vendors, Sun, Apollo, IBM, HP, lots of companies based their graphical user interfaces on X Window. But each of those companies thought, oh, this is a great interface, but let's add some new feature to it to make our version even better. And then they looked at the license and said, hey, we don't have to give that feature back to other people, right? So let's keep it to ourselves. So each major Unix vendor made their own version of the X Windows system that had their own enhancements, right? But they didn't give it back, which meant the overall program didn't improve. And if you wanted all of the best features of X, you had to run all of them, and you can't. You couldn't get a single version of X that had all the nice features from all the vendors. Now, look, they did try and combat this, and really quite successfully in some ways, basically by putting peer pressure. They used engineering work groups to try to encourage the vendors to contribute back, right? Because they knew that the vendors could be convinced in some cases that if we don't contribute back, the whole thing's going to stagnate, or fragment as it's called, right, into a lot of little versions, okay? But some companies refused to provide their contributions back because they thought their contribution was particularly good. Everyone always does think that their contribution is the best. It's just human nature, right? And so a lot of contributions weren't made back. Now it's been largely solved because there's now a whole lot of engineering effort being done directly by the X Consortium and really more by freedesktop.org, which is a new consortium that has spun off from, if you like, or is the logical descendant of the original X Window development. And that the developers work directly on the original version rather than on the vendor versions. Plus, most of the activity in the X Window space is now happening within the GNU Linux community, and that community has a strong tradition of giving changes back. Even if you aren't required to give them back, there is a strong tradition to give them back anyway, right? So that sort of solved the problem. But for a long time there was this problem of things fragmented, and it happened in a lot of code that was licensed either under the BSD or X11 license. So copyleft is the attempt to solve that problem, to make sure that once the software starts out free, that all the derived works, the new versions of it, remain free. Okay, this is the new version of that same clause that has been rewritten for GPL version 3, and it's been written in such a way as to be more applicable in more jurisdictions. Because one of the problems with GPL v2 is it was written with American law in mind, and the new version has had some input from a whole lot of lawyers in other countries to try to make it applicable in as many countries as possible. And so the new wording is you must license the entire work as a whole under this license to anyone who comes into possession of a copy. This license will therefore apply, along with any applicable Section 7 additional terms, that's a twist in GPL v3, to the whole of the work and all its parts, regardless of how they are packaged, etc. Right? So same concept to ensure that derived works are under the same license, just worded in a different fashion. And this same concept has been applied in many licenses. And generally it's, when you refer to a license, you say it's a copyleft license, meaning it includes something that means roughly this, right? That future works are going to be derived under a similar, be distributed under a similar license. Okay, So let's look at another licensing thing that's very important for people who are developing code in the free software community, GPL versus LGPL. So there's two variants of the GNU General Public License. There's the GNU General Public License itself, called the GPL, and there is the what is now known as the lesser GNU General Public License, but was originally known as the Library General Public License. Now, the difference is how it defines a derived work, it's not actually the definition of derived work it changes. It changes what works are covered by the copyleft clause. And in the GPL, if I had my program, say Samba, and somebody creates a new program that uses the abilities of Samba to create a new work, then under copyright law that's a derived work, which means they have to license their new work also under the same license. That's fine. Excuse me, that's fine. But say I release a library, and say that library is a graphics library that adds the ability to draw circles, right? libcircle.so, okay? Draws wonderful circles. Now, you've got this libcircle.so, and imagine it was licensed under the GNU General Public License. Now, if you create an application, your big com, some big company, and you wanted to create an application, and you want to be able to draw circles in that application. If libcircle was licensed under the GNU General Public License, that would mean that you have to release the entire application under the GNU General Public License. Right? That's great for free software. Right? That tries to push free software along. But what will happen if there's an alternative to libcircle? There's some other circle library which works just as well as my libcircle, but it's released under a different either proprietary license or a license that doesn't have these types of copyleft clauses in it. And you're some big company. Which one are you going to choose? You'll probably choose the one that doesn't require you to release your whole application under GPL because you've decided that free software is no good and you've decided to release your big application under a proprietary license. Okay? So, the purpose of the LGPL is that when it doesn't look like we can win the battle and if there is only one library that does this particular task, right, then we want to release it under the GPL to try to get as many people who need this library to use the GNU GPL and try to get as much free software produced as possible because we're trying to enhance the free software world. But if there's a competing library out there which has similar functionality, ours might be slightly better or have slightly more features, and that license isn't released under a copyleft license, then we know that we probably won't be able to compete. And we're better off getting those big companies to use at least some free software, so we license it under the LGPL, and the LGPL says that if you make any changes to the Circle library itself, you have to release those changes. But just by using the library, your whole application doesn't become a GPL application. You following that? So it changes the boundary of where the license applies. Does it apply just to the work itself, or does it apply to all derived works that are dependent upon that work, original work? And that's the GPL versus the LGPL. And when it was originally called the Library GPL, a lot of people who didn't read the license carefully just assumed they should use the LGPL for all libraries. After all, it's the Library GPL. Use it for all libraries, right? That had the disadvantage that we lost some of the leverage in the free software community. It meant that when the library really was unique, we weren't providing pressure to people to produce more free software, right? Because they didn't have to release their application as free software. But, so the name of the library was changed from Library GPL to Lesser GPL to emphasize that you really should only use it when there is some competing library out there which is licensed under a different license. In that case, we go for the lesser win, which is to get them to use at least some free software and hopefully enhance that, but they don't have to necessarily license their whole application. So it's basically a political decision to create this LGPL And it aims to maximise the use of free software in the world and the production of free software. So it aims to maximise the amount of free software which will be produced by other people. Okay, so you also get quite a common thing where if you write a library and release it under the GPL, I've written lots of libraries and released them under the GPL, people email me and say, hi, I've got some other application that is licensed under the LGPL, but I want to use your library. Would you mind relicensing your library under the LGPL? And sometimes I say yes, and sometimes I say no. And whether I say yes or no depends upon who's asking. If the person asking is doing it in order to enhance free software in some way, I might say yes. If, however, the person asking is wanting to use it in a proprietary application, I say no, because I don't want to benefit proprietary applications. I want to benefit other free software applications with my work. Okay, so it's quite a common thing. If you do release a GPL library, you often get emails from people asking for it to be changed to the old GPL. I'll show you one of those emails later into the talk on FOSS culture. Right, GPL version 3. This is a recent evolution of the GPL, released in June 2007. It was quite unique in licenses. Mostly licenses are written by a fairly small number of people. Cathedral-type development of licenses. Usually there's a lawyer and one or two developers. They get together and they write the license. Well, for GPL version 3, it was decided to have a much more public consultation process. So there was 18 months where drafts of the license were publicly available, and there was a sophisticated comment system where people could, like a wiki, go in and edit lines of the license, adding their own comments on why they thought this was good or bad, right? And thousands of people commented on the license. And then there was a series of, I think it was 4 committees, I was on committee A, who then looked at all of those comments, those thousands of comments, and tried to work out, did they make sense? Was it a good point? Should we incorporate that suggested change in the license? Do we have to go back to the lawyers and see if we have to make, check out whether the suggested change works in all jurisdictions, etc. And then there was conferences. There were several conferences all over the world, and the sole purpose of the conference was to discuss the new license and decide, is it a good license? So I went to the conference that was at MIT in late 2006, or it was maybe early 2007. And there was hundreds of people at that conference, all there to discuss the next generation of this license, because it's such an important license. GPL version 2 was used by hundreds of thousands of programs, 75% roughly of the all-free software, and so it was very important when creating a new version to get it right. But it was quite a unique process to go through like that, to have the public discussion. The main changes that ended up going into GPL v3, it was a complete rewrite. There's very few words in common between version 3 and version 2, right? The same concepts, the same principles apply in version 3 to version 2, but written in a different way. One of the main changes was internationalisation and clarification of the legal language. There were points which were fairly obvious what they meant to lay engineers when they read it, but lawyers could argue that it meant something different. And you need to pin down the language to make sure that everyone understands exactly what it means. So a lot of clarification of legal language and a lot of changes to make it work better in multiple jurisdictions, particularly multiple countries. Much stronger patent provisions. And I'll be talking more about patents in the next lecture. Patents are one of the great dangers to the free software world. And so a lot of effort was put into trying to defend against possible problems from patents in the GPL version 3. There was also prevention of hardware restrictions. There's a catchphrase called TiVoization, and I'll talk more about it in a later lecture. But it was a real watershed in the free software community. This, the TiVo, you've seen ads for TiVo? They've finally come out in Australia. In fact, they've been available in Australia for hackers for a while, for hobbyists. But the TiVo has principally been a US thing up till now. And they did some things with the licensing, even though they were based upon Linux, they did some things that were allowed by the GPL version 2, or arguably could be allowed by GPL version 2, but which upset many people in the Linux community. And the things they did are generally called TiVoization, and the GPL version 3 attempts to prevent that sort of thing from happening again. It also adds optional clauses to aid license interoperability. Remember I said there were 63 OSI licenses and 80-something licenses on the GNU homepage. And the idea was to try to be able to merge some of these licenses. So the way it was done was to add some optional clauses. So when you're creating the license, you can choose to use GPL version 3 and then tick some boxes to say, I want GPL version 3 plus that clause, and that clause. So we can have one unifying license that replaces a whole lot of other licenses. And it's been moderately successful in doing that. Plus, there's something called the DMCA, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which is a piece of evil legislation in the United States that unfortunately is coming into Australia as well. And that legislation has a concept of an effective technological measure, which really should be called an ineffective technological measure because they're almost always ineffective. But anyway, that DMCA is a copyright act that was supposedly meant to prevent piracy, but is actually used by companies to prevent, to bolster their sales really in particular areas and to restrict what users can do with a product, like a CD or a DVD or something like that. And so that has caused a lot of trouble in the free software community. And so there was particular clauses put into GPL version 3 to prevent free software being used as part of what's called ETP, Effective Technological Protection Measure, to prevent free software being classified as that sort of measure, to prevent the types of restrictions the DMCA applying to free software into the future. Okay, multiple licensing, this is also quite common. Yep, almost over time, yep. So it's quite common to release a program under more than one license at the same time. And you often do this because you want the program to be used by that group which uses this license. You also want the program to be used by this other group which uses that license. So you say, I release it under your choice of licenses, and the recipient can choose which license they use it under, one or the other. They can't sort of merge the two. They can choose either to use it under this license or under that license. Right? They can choose either set of conditions. So that's a very common solution to inter-project license problems when there's disputes between clashes of licenses. There's also something which is sort of a multiple licensing technique with an or later clause, and it's quite controversial in the Linux community, where you have a clause that says this program is free software, you can redistribute it, etc. under the GPL, either version 2 of the license or at your option any later version. And these days most of my software says either version 3 of the license or at your option any later version. So what's good and bad about having an or later clause?
Bad is that you've got to hope that any later license still holds the same values that you want to.
That's right. You better hope that later versions of the license have similar values. And what's good about the or later clause?
You don't have to keep updating all of your stuff to say.
You don't have to keep updating, and you don't have to contact all of your contributors. There might be thousands of contributors. Some of them might be dead. And when you go to update the license on your code, you have to contact all your contributors and get their permission to change the license. Right? If some of them are dead or moved overseas or now work in a rock band, which means they might as well be dead, then you can't contact them, which means that you can't change your license. So that's why the or later clause. Now, I like the or later clause. Some people don't like it because they don't trust the authors of the license to make the next license good. Okay, so that's it on licensing. Now that's, as I said, there's conferences, whole conferences on licensing, in fact multiple conferences on licensing every year, so it's a very complex topic. You've just had 1 hour on it, but hopefully you've now got enough to understand when somebody talks about a BSD license or a copyleft license or a GPL license, and you see that on your projects, then you know roughly what it means. Great, so enjoy lunch.